When I graduated from college, I remember the moment that I took my last class and I just finished, and I walked into the factory where I worked, and I was like, yes, I'm all done. And they're like, that's great. And they're like, we just got another order for 10,000 dog leashes. Go and cut some more rope. Here I was thinking I'd gotten something done, and turns out I just have to go back to the factory, right? You've got the work to do. When I graduated seminary, Dr. King, my friends and I were standing in the yard, and we were all so excited, and we thought we'd accomplished something. And Dr. Kinghorn walked up and said, I'm so proud of all of you. Years ago, Dr. Kinlaw walked up to us and he said, congratulations, you graduated from seminary. You just cut your chances of heaven by 50%. Then he said, teachers are judged more harshly. Great, wonderful, thanks, looking forward to it. But anyway, I graduated seminary and they put me in that first church, and I don't know if you know this, but the ordination process in the United Methodist Church is rather lengthy. I declared my candidacy in 1995, but at this point it's 2001. I've had to go to college and seminary in between, and now what they've given me is this long list of theological questions, and I have to answer like 40 of them, 40 theological questions. And then I have to give 12 copies of each question on separate pieces of paper, and so each question had to have 12 copies. And then at the time, this is kind of before email, kind of before Google Documents and sorts of things. And then I had to have a psychological evaluation. We all had to do it. Just fill you in. I had to have 3, by the way. Because they kept timing out, you see. And Tara's done it too. I'm not alone. And you get it all done, and I remember you work on it for months, right? But no matter how much you work on it ahead of time, you know that the day before it's due, you're just going to be up all night. Like, that's what's going to happen. So that's what I did, and then I drove to the registrar's house. He wasn't too far from where I was at that point. And I remember putting that box down on his porch and just feeling like freedom. Like it was the most heady experience I've ever had. I laid it on the desk, and then I still had to do the interview. And then the interview day was so nerve-wracking. It was just absolutely deadly, and I thought, I'm never going to get through this, and I did. And then the time came for your first commissioning service. Oh, it's beautiful. It was at Purdue University, and it's gorgeous, and they've got a huge 100-voice choir, and they've got all these wonderful, pieces of music. And I remember walking on stage, and they had the big screens and everything, and beautiful artwork everywhere. And I'm walking, I'm like, oh, it's so beautiful. I just can't believe it. And I ran into the pulpit, and I ran into the pulpit, and thank goodness no one saw that. And then when we're sitting there, you all. Maybe you're feeling a little squunchy today. Oh, it's worse on that stage because we're all in those folding chairs and we're all like this. And I'm a big guy, I'm sitting here like this, and you can't bend forward because the next row of chairs is basically right here. And that's when I realized one of my shoes had come untied. A lot like now, actually. And so I'm starting to freak out a little bit. And as I'm sitting there, I realized that this shoe can't. Oh, that's because my friend Julia stepped on that shoestring as well. So now both of my shoes are untied. And so the time comes where you're supposed to stand behind the altar in a line. So we're all standing here, and I'm behind the altar, and we're standing here like this. We can see ourselves on the screen. And here's Sherry Rohr and Julie, and there's the Van Wycks over there. And all of a sudden Julie goes, your shoes are untied. I said, I know they are. I can't do anything about it. And so the time comes, and here are my shoestrings flopping everywhere, and you're supposed to kneel in front of the altar, and there they are, and I'm like, I am not stopping to tie these shoes. Lifting up the robes, and then being affectionately produced on what we affectionately used to call the Jumbotron. Oh yeah, that's going to happen. And I thought I'd accomplished something. Until they called us in for the next retreat and let us know for the next 3 years we're going to be watching you, and you're going to have to check in every year, and you're going to have a second psychological evaluation, and you're going to have to do all this stuff. And then finally I got ordained which was a lot like the previous experience, except this time I wore shoes that didn't have to tie. And it's marvelous, and it's romantic, and it's beautiful, and you think you've accomplished something, and then the next day, conference is over, the ordination service is done, and they go back to work. You know? I always thought it was so interesting, and how we work so hard to make it to a certain place, you know? And you know, that's my life, but I bet you've had some of those things too, where you got there, and it doesn't diminish the accomplishment at all, but there is kind of this feeling that comes along with it of, well, what now? What now? Matt Damon talks about his experience of winning, you know, if you'll remember, he was in the movie Good Will Hunting. He and Ben Affleck wrote that together. And they were two of the youngest people ever to win an Oscar for screenwriting. You know, they both won an Oscar because they both wrote that script. And Matt Damon talked about going home, and he sat there and he looked at the award and he thought, thank goodness I didn't have to hurt anyone to get this, because it just isn't worth it, you know? And he's looking at an Oscar, you know, that's not a small accomplishment, but I think there comes this point where you realize what's worth something and what isn't. I mean, isn't it one of those statements that people make when they say, at the end of your life, will you look back and say, oh, I wish I would have worked more, you know? Today in the scripture reading, we read about a man who comes to Jesus. And he seems, by all accounts, to be a righteous and good man, a good guy, right? He's kept all the commandments. When he tells Jesus, oh, I've kept all of those commandments since I was a child, it says that Jesus looks at him carefully. And the word look in this, I looked up the Greek this week, it did kind of have this concept of examination. That Jesus is kind of seeing past what he's seeing into this man's heart. This is kind of what the feeling of the text is. And it says, and Jesus loved him. And there's just this feeling of Jesus sees, this is a good guy. We've got the heart of something good here. And he says, tell you what, do one more thing. Take all you have and sell it and give it to the poor, and then follow me. And the man looks at him sadly and he walks away. I think we all want to be a very important person. We all want to be people who are listened to, and we all want to be people who maybe are powerful in their region of life, in their sphere of influence, right? And it doesn't seem to matter what part of the quote-unquote food chain you're on, whether you're the President of the United States, or you're the Queen of England, or you're a janitor at the 7-Eleven. There's always this idea that we have that we want to be somewhat stronger or somewhat higher than someone else. One of my favorite British television shows, absolute favorite, I can watch it all the time, and it's really, really old. It started off when the televisions were in black and white, is Are You Being Served? Some people know, yeah. Hilarious, isn't it? And it's about a bunch of people who work in a store, right? And even though it's just this sort of middle-brow store, the reality is that every person in that store wants to be a little bit higher than the other person. Everybody wants to take control just that much more. And all of us have jobs, and all of us have been working in our lives, and we all know that that's true, don't we? We all know that there's always just that feeling of, no, I'm the person in charge, right? And we see this man in the gospel story, and he has all of this stuff, right? He has all this wealth. He has all these wonderful possessions, but he just doesn't want to let them go. And I want you to think about the question for a moment. Now, Jesus may not be calling all of us to give everything we have away and give it to the poor. But that was Jesus calling for this person. And Jesus speaks to this man and he says, here, give all you have to the poor. Now, what would the man have gained if he had done so? Fine. I'll fix it later. But what would this man have given up? What would this man have received if he had done as Jesus asked? Well, I bet we would have known his name. I bet he would have been a 13th disciple. We would have called him Saint something, right? The same way we have Saint Matthias and Saint Matthew and Saint Luke. This man would have been remembered throughout history as one of the followers of Jesus. But he didn't. This man also would have gone on a marvelous adventure, changing the force of history. He would have changed everything. He would have created, he would have been a part of the very foundation of what the Christian church would one day become. In all the places where the church finds himself, he would have been a part of that legacy, but instead, he's remembered as the person who couldn't let go of his possessions, and so he walked away. In Jesus' time, the Jewish people believed that the wealthy must be righteous and therefore must be blessed because God has given them so much wealth. Therefore, they must be good people and therefore they must be righteously blessed. That God had blessed them because that's why they're wealthy. They're good people. Therefore, they are wealthy. And so when Jesus says, oh, it's so hard for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, his disciples, you read, were shocked. But he's rich. Doesn't that mean God blessed him because he's wealthy? Doesn't that mean he's a good man because God has given him so much wealth? If he can't make it into heaven, what hope is there for the rest of us, right? They firmly believe that the wealthy are the persons whom God has blessed. Now, how many of us in this room know that isn't necessarily true? How many of us know that the wealthy people in the world are not necessarily the good people? How many of us know that? And so the question comes, what is it we value? What is it we desire? What is it we want to be in the world? Do we want to be the person who holds on to their possessions, or do we want to be the person that changes the focus of history for the better? That was what Jesus was offering the man, the person that we don't even know his name. That's what Jesus was offering to him. You can hold on to what you got, or you can come and follow me and begin something marvelous and powerful and new. That invitation is always in front of us. That invitation to follow Jesus, to make real and lasting change and really truly make the world better. And that invitation isn't always something that you would recognize it as at the time. As I remember the story of Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who was not a perfect person, but definitely saintly, she always tells the story about how she was living in a monastery, in a lovely, gorgeous monastery in India. She had all the food she wanted, all the comfort that she wanted. She could pray, she could be devoted to God. And one day they were out doing their grocery shopping, and as they passed by, she saw a starving child. And she said, I could go back to the monastery that night and pray for that child, but instead, I went over and I picked up that first child. And that's what led me to pick up the following 100,000. She heard the invitation. Give it up. Give it up, Mother Teresa, and follow this child. Pick up the child. What is our child? What is God calling us to do? What is God calling us to be? When Jesus says, let go of something to you and follow me here, what does he want us to let go of? A few ideas come to mind in my own life. But the reality is, there are two types of very important people. There's the world's model, right? Maybe have an entourage, maybe have a gold tracksuit, I don't know. And then there's Christ's model of the very important person. I often think about this little church that I went to in Kentucky. As part of my education, we had to do what's called a church assessment, and we went into a church community and we offered them advice on how to grow their church or how to make their church a better place. So the place we got chosen for was Barry, Kentucky. You've surely heard of Barry, Kentucky, right? London, Paris, Milan, Barry, right? And so we go to Barry, Kentucky, and I'm there for my own personal evaluation. And so I go in and I drive to this church. And let's just say if I had heard banjos, I would have, gunned the engine and left, because it was really, really rural. And I arrived in this little town, and town is generous. I'm being very generous with the word town. I'd be generous with the word village. And I come to the church that has absolutely no parking. And so you have to park in a parking lot across town, which wasn't far. And so they had this communal parking lot for the whole town, and so that's where you parked for church. And I walked over to the church, and I'm not kidding you, if this is the front door of the church, Where those front row of chairs were was the train tracks. And you kind of walked along this little path, and you come into the church that had shall we say, outdoor plumbing. You know, had an outhouse, you know, kind of thing. And I sit down, and there's this gentleman, and I'm listening to the Sunday school lesson because I got there early, and that's in the sanctuary, and they're talking about all of this stuff, and then all of a sudden, the train goes by. And every chandelier in the room is shaking, and dust is falling from the ceiling, right? And all these people are here, and they just... And then it ends, right? And then they get started again. So then the service starts, and they hand out, they had a little Ziploc bag, and they started handing it down the aisle, and it was filled with candy. You know, and so they're handing this out, that, you know, every person's getting a bag of candy from their communal bag of candy, right? And the service continues, and as the pastor gets up to preach, and he starts getting going, and he's fire and brimstone in it pretty well, actually, up there. And he's preaching, and oh, amen, amen. And the train went by, and he didn't have to, you could still hear him, right? But everything's shaking, and he's still, you know, shouting to the rooftops, and all of these people are in it, and they're connected, and they're listening, and they're engaged, right? And I started thinking, I have never seen this kind of faith in any church I've ever been in. Like, it didn't matter, like, it wasn't a gorgeous, beautiful sanctuary. It was useful, it was practical. They didn't have a lot of money, you know. They didn't have a lot of wealth, but they were so utterly connected to who God was. It's not the greatest things in the world, the wisest things that show that are the most important in the kingdom of God, are there? Sometimes it's the simplest things, right? Now, all of this leads us to one reality check for all of us. Sometimes we feel like, well, what can I do? I'm not theologically trained. I'm not very good at reading my Bible. I'm not very good at any of those things. But when someone, your friend, is sick, can you reach out a hand and hold it for them for a while? Can you send them a card that tells them that you love them? Can you see that person across the street who's struggling after a death and walk over and say, hey, just want to let you know if you need anything, let me know. Can you do those things? Because as the story goes, it's the small itty-bitty things. It's the little itty-bitty mustard seed that grow into the tallest of garden plants. It's the smallest things that happen that cause the greatest results. It isn't about wealth. It isn't even necessarily about opportunity. It is about listening to the invitation and saying, yes. And then maybe, just maybe, you'll be a VIP in the kingdom of God. One quick thing. This sermon is actually a little bit of a series. Next Sunday, this topic is, the sermon title is not VIP, but the VIP section.